QSO Today, episode 201, John Stanley K4ERO. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, who reminds you that as Field Day rapidly approach, now is the time for a new ICOM HF rig, and by QRP Labs, my favorite ham radio kit company, and home of the QCX transceiver for under $50 US. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth4Z1UG, your host. My QSO Today is with John Stanley K4ERO, a frequent contributor of articles about antenna design and performance to QST, QEX, the ARRL Antenna Book, and the ARRL Handbook. An MIT graduate, John and his wife Ruth, WB4LUA, spent many years abroad working as engineers for Christian broadcast stations in India and South America. John shares his ham radio story and his antenna expertise in this QSO Today. K4ERO, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, John?
4Z1UG, this is K4ERO.
John, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Yeah, that would be great. Well, I am originally from Maryville, Tennessee, which is just south of Knoxville. I spent my formative years there, but during the war, my dad was in the Army Air Force and as a dentist. And so up until 1945, we moved around a lot in the U.S. He never was deployed overseas. My mom was from Massachusetts, and actually my grandfather is the one that first got me interested in technical things. He was his name was John Chisholm, and he was an employee of the Bell Telephone Company in Boston. He never finished high school, but he had worked his way up in the Bell system. And according to my grandmother, at one point he had MI grads working under him, which was quite interesting. And in the 1920s, he had built a one-tube regenerative receiver and later a four-tube set with an RF amp, regenerative detector, and 2 stages of audio. And I still have those 2 receivers.
Wow.
And he helped me build a crystal set also when I was about 10. So that was my first introduction to anything related to radio.
Oh, that's very cool. How did it go from there? I mean, what happened after that?
Well, I was pretty active in Boy Scouts, so I got my radio merit badge, and that included building a one-tube regenerative set for the AM broadcast band. So I built that and used to listen to that, and my brothers also, we had extra headphones, so 2 or 3 of us could listen at a time. So I was quite interested in radio before hamming was a part of my life. Of course, back in those days, every family had a console radio in the living room, and ours happened to have shortwave band on it. I listened to the Lone Ranger and Amos and Andy and those programs on the AM band, but would occasionally go up to the shortwave band and hear HCJV and the BBC. And I tuned across some hams on 75 meters that turned out to be the Tennessee net. They have met for time immemorial on 3980 kilohertz. And I would listen in on them, but I didn't really know what ham radio was, or I didn't. If you'd said what's a ham, I wouldn't have known. But I did enjoy listening to those guys. Well, anyway, the next step was that a very dear friend of my father, who we called Uncle Harvey, he was actually no kin to us, but had been a dear friend of my dad, W4KIW, was vacationing with our family one time in Jacksonville, Florida. We had been in Jacksonville during the war. So we used to go back there, for summer vacations. And one day, Uncle Harvey and his family were there. And he brought up the question of ham radio and said that he would teach my brothers and I Morse code with a view to getting our novice, which was just, very new license class back then. I was one of 4 boys and a little sister who came along much later. But the 4 of us boys were the target of his Elmering efforts. And I was the only one that really was interested. So Uncle Harvey taught me Morse code, and that eventually led to my novice license.
Oh, that's quite amazing. And so, when was it that you got your novice license, and how old were you?
I would have been about 15 or 16. I had I still have an original K4 call And in my high school class, there was another young ham my same age. In fact, he had one of the very first K4 calls that were issued, the K4 Alpha Alpha Victor. Name was Larry Rockfield, and he's now N6UB. He was in my high school class, and he got his ticket before I did. And I happened to be by his house one day, and he showed me his shack, and he was on 10 meters, which was wide open to the west coast from Tennessee. And I was just amazed that here was a guy sitting there talking in his bedroom, really talking to people out, all along the west coast on AM phone. And I still know Larry. I talked to him from time to time on 75 meters. But the K4 calls were just starting to be given out, so I went ahead and got mine, and then. Do
you remember what it was?
Yeah, it's the same call I've got.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, of course, it was KN4ERO because I got a novice, but I dropped the N after a year. And some of my buddies also got licensed. The most significant of those was Don Moore, who was then and is now K4HVJ. He had another call sign for a while when he was working in New Jersey for Bell Labs, but he as a vanity call, he got his original K4 call back. And we were best friends in high school. Later on, we were MIT roommates, and he reminded me of a while back of the first time we met. We were in high school biology class, and he happened to sit down at the same little, we sat 2 by 2 in little desks where we, cut frogs up and stuff. and he happened to notice that I had KN4ERO written on my notebook in big letters on the outside of my notebook. And so he was very fascinated because he had always been interested in radio, but had the idea that you had to be a certain age to get a ham license. But when he found out that I had my ticket, then he got his. And yeah, it was sometime in the fall of '56 that would have been.
Now, do you think
that's how we got started?
Were there a lot of hams in your area in those days?
There really were. Yeah, we had a number of very active hams. All of them except us high school kids, of course, had W4 calls. And I was checking with Larry Rockfield, who had the K4 Alpha Alpha Victor call, about the call signs of some of those guys because I'd forgotten them, but there were a bunch of them. And Maryville had a very active ham club, and they were very, very helpful. One of them was a guy named Jack Huffstutler, W4BXG, and he helped me get my novice transmitter working, which was a kit. But there were 5 or 6 others that I knew well. One of them was named Elwood West, and he was a younger guy too. And I've forgotten his call and couldn't find out what it was. But Elwood was an amazing guy. He had some physical disabilities, but he had a near genius IQ, and he went on to have a tremendous career in electronics. But I saw the first multimeter that I had ever seen at his house one time, and I said, I got to have one of those. That is cool as can be. And since then, I have always loved test equipment. I almost enjoy my test equipment as much as I do the ham gear.
So we'll get into test equipment a little bit later. We'll get into test equipment a little bit later. But let me ask you, what was your first rig?
Well, I got apart from that shortwave receiver that I used to listen to AM on, I got a National SW50, which was one of the simpler rigs back in those days. I think about 6 tubes, and quite a few novices would get that radio. And I got that along with this kit for building a novice transmitter. It used a 6L6, and I think probably had a 5U4 or some kind of a rectifier on the same chassis with a transformer. That's the one I built from a kit.
That was the Amico, maybe?
No, it was some off-brand. I don't remember. Those Amicos were very popular, and by the way, they sell for a pretty good price now on eBay.
Right, if you can find them, right.
Yeah, this was some no-name thing. I can't remember doesn't ring a bell, and that rig is long since gone, of course. But it was probably the circuitry was
what?
Was very similar to the Amico. I don't remember exactly what the circuit was in the Amico, but this was basically a 6L6, just a crystal oscillator 6L6 with Pi network output.
Now, you were very impressed with Larry's AM station on 10 meters. Did voice become your primary mechanism for or primary transmitting mode, or did you have a primary or a favorite in those days?
I had a very undistinguished novice career. I probably worked about 20 stations in a year. And so then I got my tech license because you couldn't renew the novice, and I wanted to keep my call sign. And in those days, you could only operate above 220 megahertz with the tech license. So Don Moore, K4HVJ, and I built up some gear for 440. We called it back in those days, modulated oscillators, and I think we talked between our houses, which were a couple of miles apart. But then, shortly after that, the 6 meters was opened up to technicians, and boy, we went crazy after that. We both got NC98 receivers. We got AM transmitters for 6 meters. I had one that used a 2E26 in the final, and ran about 10 watts. But we got real active on 6 meters. And there was a lot of activity in those days in that area. Of course, my home is quite close to Oak Ridge, and there are many hams in Oak Ridge, as you can imagine. And a lot of them were on 6 meters. And of course, eventually E-skip started coming in, and we went crazy because we got to work some of that, some of the DX. But we had a lot of fun on 6 meters for about a full year before we finished high school.
So did ham radio play a part then in the choices that you made for education and career?
I feel sure that it did. See, both Don and I applied to MIT. No one from our high school had ever even dreamed of that before, but we did, along with another friend of ours who was not a ham. But the three of us all were accepted to MIT, and that kind of put my high school on the map because three guys, all of a sudden out of a class of 100, had been accepted to MIT, and so after that, a bunch of them started applying, and it became one of the high schools in the state that had quite a few people that went to Boston for our education.
Well, it sounded to me like your Tennessee was a public school. Your Tennessee high school was quite unusual, or maybe the time was that they actually had great laboratories and great teachers.
They did, and we had particularly a math teacher by the name of Mrs. Baker. She was just fantastic, and she did an excellent job of teaching us, algebra and plane geometry and solid geometry. And they didn't teach calculus in high school back in those days, but we had a good foundation. And to this day, that Maryville High School is one of the top academic high schools in the state of Tennessee. And by the way, they also have the state champion football team. But I certainly did not get involved in that. My brother played football, but I was a nerd, and that was back before nerds were cool. So the fact that we had a good football team was neither here nor there, but they have always had very, very good academics at that school.
So what happened at MIT?
Well, Don and I both were enrolled, of course, in the electrical engineering course, and we had decided for sure that we were not going to operate ham radio while we were there, at least during our freshman year, because we wanted to concentrate on our studies. That didn't work out too well. That was back during one of the highest sunspot peaks in living memory. And we hadn't been there very long before we discovered, so I think Don had brought along some kind of a crude receiver. We discovered that 6 meters was opening up to the West Coast with an F2 skip. And within about a month, we had put together a station. There was a place near the campus there that sold surplus electronics. So we bought an old VHF navigation transmitter. There was some military surplus, and put it on 6 meters. And so we enjoyed many hours of working the skip on 6 meters, and I'm afraid the studies suffered somewhat.
Now, it seems to me that usually if someone gets a BSEE from MIT, they might be destined for the Bell Laboratories or some of the big electronic development companies on the East Coast. What happened to you?
Well, of course, that's exactly what Don did. He went to Bell Labs. Well, I had become involved with some church groups there in Boston, and on campus as well. We had some activities that were, Christian groups that were meeting there. MIT is not the place where you think of to have that sort of activity, but I got very involved in that. Of course, I had been brought up in the church, and so I decided that I wanted to go and work at HCJB in Quito, Ecuador, which, of course, as the whole world knows that's ever listened to them, is a Christian radio station. So I wrote them, and I said, what do I have to do to come down there and work, as an engineer? And they said, well, we like for our people to have some Bible training. And I didn't think I wanted to go to a Bible college, having already received my degree. So I enrolled in a theological seminary, and ended up enjoying it so much that I actually took 4 years of theology. And having done that, then I needed to work off the obligation that I had when I got my free theological training. That was with the Methodist Church, in which I'm still. In fact, I'm an ordained pastor in the Methodist Church. But I worked. I served churches for 2 years, and then went to India to teach in a Methodist technical college there as a way of paying back the debt that I had accrued from getting my education for 4 years in the theological school.
So you did 4 years at MIT, and then you went to the theological school?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Wow. So that's a big educational undertaking under your belt.
Yeah, it was. I think I'm the one of few people that have 7 years of graduate studies without getting a doctorate.
Now,
the secret of that is to keep changing subjects.
Oh, I know this very well. I don't think I would have graduated from college had I not gotten married. Now, it's my understanding that you have a wife who's also a ham radio operator, and there's a story about that, right?
Right. Yeah. We were, before going to India to teach in the technical college over there, I went to a place in Stony Point, New York, which is called Missionary Orientation Center. It was basically a place that taught cross-cultural living, and so I was there with the Methodist Church and preparing to go and teach at this technical college in India, and she was there with the Reformed Church in America. She's from Michigan. Her family are all Dutch. She was on her way to Taiwan. In fact, she was the second lady to ever graduate from Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan. So she was on her way to Taiwan. I was on my way to India. And there were about 60 or 70 students at this school. And all of us were planning to go overseas. So I decided I would start a novice class, because in those days, anybody that lived overseas, you could benefit from having a ham license. So she was in my class, and she joked that the deal was that if she got a ham license, I would get the marriage license. And she did very well. She's very smart. She was a grade A student all the way through school, unlike me, who always made a few B's and C's. But she did very well, got her novice license, and so I didn't feel trapped because I was in complete agreement with the deal. So we got married, and she became WB4LUA, and we went to India, and we both got reciprocal licenses over there. So she was VU2 IYL, and I was VU2 India Echo.
Wow. And how long were you in India, and what was that experience like?
Oh, well, it was very interesting. India has advanced an awfully lot in the last 50 years. Things where we were pretty primitive back then. We were in what we called a big mud village. It was 100,000 people, but very little modern stuff there. And this technical college was placed there deliberately to train people that were from the lower classes of society, shall we say, into modern, modern subjects. And we had a interesting experience. One of the sad things that happened was we had a child there who did not survive. But while she was away from me, bearing, in order to, she was in her last month of pregnancy, she was at a hospital 600 miles from me, and we set up a 20 meter link between us. And so we talked every day on 20 meters, and that was a real blessing to be able to keep in touch with her. Back in those days, the telephone system in India was very limited. It was really difficult to make a call. In fact, one of the first words or phrases that we learned in the Hindi language was "Zor se boliye," which means "please speak louder." Because if you ever talked on the telephone, that was the main phrase that you used. And of course, they've come so very, very far. We haven't been back to India since we left. I'd love to do so because they've advanced so much. But I enjoyed operating a lot from there. I worked a lot of long path back into the States, which was really a very, 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 very nice.
And now this message from ICOM America. Now that Dayton is behind us, the next big event is Field Day on the weekend of June 23rd and 24th. Take your ICOM gear into the field with your club or as a lone contester. The new ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling SDR software-defined radio with high-performance RMDR that has the ability to pick out the faintest signals even in the presence of other rigs in your field day site. This is the perfect rig to take out with a club. Its dual independent receiver design and dual digicell makes this rig even more fun when you're teamed up with one of your field day partners. The compact and state-of-the-art ICOM 7300 is the perfect field day companion and is ideal for the ham on the go. With its RF direct sampling receiver with 15 bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, and a real-time spectrum scope, allows even the beginner ham to know what's happening in the band to find even more field day contacts. The ICOM 7300 feature set and value are way ahead of other amateur rigs in its price class. For the amateur radio operator that wants it all, the best ICOM all-around rig is the ICOM IC9100 HF, VHF, and UHF transceiver capable of all modes in all bands including RTTY, D-Star, digital voice, satellite, and even moon bounce. ICOM's years of radio experience is reflected in this top-of-the-line amateur transceiver. The ICOM IC9100 has independent dual receivers, digital IF filters, satellite mode where the rig compensates for Doppler shift as the satellite flies overhead, and built-in antenna tuner. The ICOM 9100 can be connected by USB cable to your computer to operate digital modes or even remote control. George Thomas has a great video demonstrating the features of the IC9100 and the value of this amazing rig on his Amateur Logic TV channel. I'll put a link to that next to the ad in this week's show notes. So as the contest season begins, be ready with your ICOM station today. And when you make that purchase, be sure to tell them that you heard it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. What kind of rigs would you have taken to India in those days so that the two of you could have a 20-meter link?
Well, actually, when I first went over there was some question about whether I would get the license or not. And they were quite suspicious of people who had communications equipments who were not properly licensed. So the only thing I took was a receiver. It was a multi-LMAC PMR8, which you may be familiar with. But it was a ham bands only, plus, of course, AM broadcast band receiver. I had to get a receiving license for that, actually, because following the British model, they required anybody with a radio receiver to get a license. And so I got the license for that. And I had to build a transmitter from scratch after I got there. Of course, being at a technical college, there was, a certain amount of equipment available and so forth, both test equipment and tubes and whatnot, and so I was able to build a rig, and then later on we had a barrel of goodies shipped over, and I had included in that. By that time we were licensed, so I was able to import a Heathkit HW32, and that was the rig that she took with her when she went to the place where she stayed, where she was going to give birth to our child. And of course, I kept my rig, my homebrew rig there at the school where I was.
Now the HW32, I think they had in those days rigs that were single banders, right?
That's what that was, right? It was the Heathkit single banders, and it was only for 20 meters.
It was like it looked like the HW101 without the
pretty
band
much,
switching.
Yeah, right, the green paint job, and that's the one.
So what happened after that? I mean, you left India, and did you ever get to Ecuador?
Yes, we left India because of a little war that occurred between Pakistan and India. Had a little war that led to the formation of Bangladesh, which of course at once was known as East Pakistan. And India was very much involved in that war. At that time, the U.S. was a pretty close ally of Pakistan. So, and India was more aligned with the Soviet Union. So that we got caught up in a Cold War deal there. And we became persona non grata in India because of our government, having supported their enemy. And so we were not able to continue there. So we then reevaluated the question of where we would go next. And Ecuador seemed to be the most logical place. So that's when we came home and were home for a few months, and then headed down to Ecuador to begin a 13-year term of service down there at HCJB.
And what did you do down there?
Well, I was at the transmitting site. The transmitting site is outside of Quito. At that time, they had 7 shortwave transmitters, and I began just as a transmitter maintenance engineer. But within a year, I was the chief engineer at that site there. And Ruth did a lot of stuff too. She was the editor of a magazine, a DX magazine that we published down there called Andex, ANDEX. You can find all of those back issues that online, by the way. And I wrote, that's when I first started doing some fairly extensive writing. I wrote a propagation column for that magazine, if you want to call it. It was really a 4-page, it's not really a magazine, but 4 to 8 pages of information of interest to shortwave listeners. And then she was also an engineering secretary and helped me build a couple of 10 kilowatt transmitters. And so she was very much involved. But yeah, I was just doing basic engineering or supervising others who were doing that.
Now, your Andex magazine, I guess I can see where you got the Andex from the Andes, perhaps.
Right.
But where was the distribution for this magazine? Was it North America?
It was distributed to people who were members of our club. We had the club was called Andex, and it's for Andes DXers. And it had somewhere about 4,000 to 5,000 members who were members. They would write in and they would send, I think, $10 or something a year, and be members of this club. And part of what they got was the magazine, and then they had other, special free postage on QSL cards and other perks that they got from being members of the club.
So your members could be worldwide then?
Oh yes, they were. They were all over the place.
Well, that's quite amazing, because you were actually relying on the post office for delivery of the magazine.
Yeah.
From Ecuador.
Yeah. Now they did also have a weekly Andex program, so all of the members would potentially tune into the program. And when Ruth first took over the club, there was another guy down there by the name of Clayton Howard, who is very well known in DXing. I'm talking shortwave listening circles, and he was very popular. And he had this half-hour program every week that would, have tips about how to hear strange and unusual stations on shortwave and so forth. and then I think Ruth eventually did some of that also. But yeah, it was in connection with the DX Club, which was both on air and but also had this bulletin that was mailed out.
Oh, well, that's pretty cool. So it was the shortwave broadcasting station itself that had the Andex program.
Exactly.
I see. Oh, and that's how it attracted the listeners. Oh, well, that's amazing.
Yes. So
kind of like QSO Today, on the internet.
Yeah. It's not. I would say maybe half of the members of Andex were also ham operators, but their interest in HCJB, of course, was as shortwave listeners. So there's quite a bit of overlap between those two hobbies, of course.
You're a technical advisor to the ARRL and write for QST, QEX, the Antenna Book, and the ARRL Handbook. How did that begin for you?
Well, actually, that happened due to a connection with HCJB. There was an engineer down there, Chuck. Boy, his last name escapes me right now, and that's really embarrassing. But I have a problem with names. Anyway, he was an engineer at HCJB, a ham, of course, and I knew him very well. And both he and his wife were hams. When he left Ecuador, he came and worked in headquarters in Newington. He worked for ARRL. And so at that time, they were looking for people with a technical background to be appointed as technical advisors. And so he suggested my name. And that's been about 30 years now, I think, that I have been have had that position. I just thought of his name. Chuck Hutchinson is his name. And I don't remember his call.
Okay. Well, we can look it up, and I'll put that in the show notes pages.
That'd be great.
What's your favorite subject to write about? Or do you write about everything?
Probably antennas more than anything else. I've written quite a few articles they used to have a series called the Antenna Compendium, volumes 1 through 6 or 7, and I wrote 4 or 5 articles for those, usually one in each issue of that for a while. And of the articles I've written for QST, I would say the majority have been antennas. In the Antenna Book, I did the chapter. I reviewed the chapter and updated it. The chapter on low periodics. The chapter that I wrote most recently for the handbook was on high-powered amplifiers, tube linear amplifiers. I had earlier written a chapter on modulation modes like AM, FM, digital, etc. But those get completely redone every 10 years. So the material that I wrote, would be in an older edition. So, yeah, I would say mainly antennas.
So here you are in Tennessee, or you're back in Tennessee. What's the rig at K4ERO? Okay,
transmitters. I've got about 4, but the ones that I use most frequently are my Yaesus. I've got a 2-meter Yaesu. I've got 2 2-meter Yaesus. I've got a 50-watt in the car, and I've got a 5-watt handheld. I've got an FT100 that I used to use mobile. In fact, I got it specifically because it has a really, really good noise blanker, and in mobile, that's absolutely essential. So that's my 100-watt all-band rig, and then I've got the little 5-watt FT, is it 817? The little 5-watt Yaesu. I use that one quite a bit. So between the 100-watt and the 5-watt Yaesus, those are the rigs that I use the most often.
So you're a QRP operator?
I do enjoy QRP. Mm-hmm. When I was at HCJB, I operated transmitters of up to 500 kilowatts, and that kind of satisfied my desire to be the high-power guy. And in fact, while I was at Ecuador, I learned to advocate for lower power because we broadcasted to many different targets at many different distances. And whereas the 500 kilowatt was often not adequate to do some of the stuff we wanted to do to Europe at times when the bands were crowded and so forth, there were other times when we did well with lower power. In fact, I got a project going down there to run 50 watts on the 11-meter shortwave broadcast band, and we advertised it as the lowest powered shortwave station in the world, and got hundreds and hundreds, probably over 1,000 QSL cards in response to that. It was using a 5-element quad, which did help. But I have always advocated and believed that you use the amount of power that you are required to use for the distance you're trying to reach. And that's why for a lot of my local 75-meter skids, I use the 5-watt radio, and it does fine.
So you're saying that HCJB, because of its location and the transmitters and the bands that you were using, that was a single spot for transmitting all over the world?
Well, they always talked about that. Sometimes the publicity department got a little bit ahead of the engineering.
As it always does.
Yeah. I used to try to give them a little bit of additional information on that. I basically said it this way: we can be heard from here at any spot in the world at some time or another, but it might not be the time when people are awake and listening to the radio. Folks might be willing to stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning to work a de-expedition, but typically to listen to a program on the radio, they don't. So you have to use, you have to ask, can we get to point X at a time when people are awake and listening to the radio? And if you can do that, how much power does it take? What kind of an antenna does it take? And so myself and a couple of other of the hams down there who knew a little bit more about propagation were constantly talking to the programming people about what is practical and what isn't practical to do. Because many of them just had the idea, well, here we are, we've got this lovely location, we've got these powerful transmitters, we can do whatever we want. And of course, as any ham knows, propagation is the big equalizer, and ultimately it determines who you can talk to and when you can talk to them, not necessarily the amount of power you're running or how big your antenna is.
So I'm curious. Let's go back to the FT817. What kind of antennas then do you have on your QTH?
Well, for my NVIS work, which means my 75-meter and 160-meter work, I have a 160-meter half wave. It's about 60 feet up in the center, a little bit less on the ends, and so that's pretty optimum for out to a few hundred miles on either 160 or 75 meters. It's a little bit high in the air for NVIS on 40 meters. So I use it for 40 meters for a little bit further distances. Then I've got a 20-meter dipole, which is about the same height, that I use for PSK, and I mainly operate QRP PSK to Europe and to the States, but that dipole is oriented, to favor Europe, and I have pretty good luck working Europeans with PSK on that.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. And now back to our QSO Today. It's my understanding that you wrote an article about feed line and antennas. What kind of feed line are you using, and are you using an antenna tuner?
Yes, antenna tuners are my hobby. I love to build antenna tuners. and most of them that I built are for a balanced line. So I'm using ladder line for my dipoles, and then I use a balanced type tuner. The type I love is the conventional old type, which is just a tune circuit with a link on the input side, and then you move the taps up and down the coil. And I have built literally dozens of those just because I love to fool around with tuners. By the way, my home brewing philosophy, I guess some people have this, but my home brew philosophy is this: you don't decide what you're going to build and then go get the parts. You look at the parts you have and decide what to build.
Well, I think that's a great idea, and I'm sure that most XYLs would think that would be also a great idea.
Yeah, right. Well, it's certainly a cheap way to go. So that's what I do. When I get ready to build something, I seldom have to buy anything. I just look around and I look and I say, oh, okay, here's a nice inductor. Here's a nice split stator capacitor. Although I found that you don't need split stator necessarily to build this type of tuner. But anyway, here's a nice capacitor. Here's a nice inductor. Here's a beautiful knob. Here's some clip leads. This is just begging to be made into an antenna tuner. So I just keep making them.
Now, your antenna tuners are QRP antenna tuners, so you don't actually need large capacitors.
Yeah, I made a whole series of QRP tuners because I kept trying to perfect the design. And those are for use with my 5-watt radio. But I've also built a number of higher powered ones for my 100-watt radio. Well, in fact, of course, I have a linear here also, but I seldom use that. I live off the grid, so I don't waste power unnecessarily.
Now, do you live off the grid by choice, or you just happen to be off the road?
Well, it's a little of both. When we first developed this property 25 years ago. See, about 25 years ago, we stopped working in Ecuador full time and started traveling. And we would have a home here in the States, but we would go to places and do broadcast work, but only for periods either of training or installations. And we would then come home. So we needed a home here. And when we built our home here, we were so far back in the woods that we really couldn't afford to have power brought in. So we went ahead and developed everything to be off grid. And now that we have neighbors that are closer, we could get on the grid, but we've just gotten used to it and we like it. So we are continuing to be off grid.
So how do you generate power off grid? Are you using solar power or something like that?
We have some solar power. My 5-watt rig has a completely independent solar power system. We have used windmills. The windmill we used was somewhat of a disaster because the wind is not suitable here in Georgia. It either blows 5 miles an hour, which is not enough, or it blows 50 miles an hour, which is too much. So that was not a successful project. So what we use more than anything else is our little Honda generator, and we run it whenever we're running stuff like shop tools. We run one of the generators. I have a number of generators. I got a 3-phase 20 kilowatt generator that I sometimes need when I'm running some of my shop tools. And then we have a medium-sized generator, and we have then the little Honda, which is what we run when we just want to charge batteries or do some light work.
Okay, so you and I are talking on Skype right now. How are you talking to me? If you're off grid, are you using some satellite link or your neighbor's Wi-Fi?
Yeah, no, I have a hotspot that works with one of the phone companies. I forget which one. One of the cell phone companies, and I'm running on batteries. I have four big golf cart batteries that are powering an inverter, which is supplying energy to my laptop, which I could unplug. I could turn off the inverter and unplug and just run on the laptop battery. And of course, the hotspot has its own battery. So,
and the hotspot is like a cell phone with a USB cable or something like that.
Well, it actually has a Wi-Fi connection.
Ah, okay.
It does have a USB. I could use the USB also, but I'm using the Wi-Fi.
Oh, that's very cool. So it's like an LTE or 3 or 4G to Wi-Fi
Yeah, it's
hotspot.
4G. It's LTE. Yeah, it's LTE hotspot. Yeah.
Oh, that's very cool. Well, it's working, and we're talking, all the way across the world.
Good.
And by the way, that may be the sound I'm hearing is you've got the inverter running. I wonder if the inverter is...
Well, hang on a minute. Hang on a minute. I'm going to turn it off, and we'll see. Okay, inverter off, and
Nope.
I'm just running on the laptop battery.
So
now.
we can't blame the inverter.
Okay, good. I do pick my inverters carefully because I try to get ones that do not produce RFI. But if I get into a situation where I have RFI, then I simply turn it off.
Which inverter are you using now?
It's something I got from a truck stop or something.
Okay. So
it's not a name brand. It's not a name brand that anyone would know.
Oh, I see. But essentially, it's designed to turn 110 or whatever's coming out of the generators, turn that into DC to charge the batteries. Oh, and then it goes the other way. Then it goes from 12.
This one goes the other way.
Right,
Yeah,
it goes the other way.
12 volts from my battery bank and makes 110.
Oh, that's cool. It's my understanding, I'm looking at the National Association of Broadcasters, one of the PowerPoint presentations, that you're an expert on DRM. What is DRM, and how is it used?
DRM is Digital Radio Mondiale, and they picked a name that would work in French and English and maybe a few other languages. It's basically a worldwide system of shortwave broadcasting or medium wave broadcasting that is digital. So what it does is it uses existing channels, existing hardware, existing antennas. So it puts into a standard shortwave channel, let's just say a 10 kilohertz wide channel, 5 kilohertz either side of the carrier. Into that space, it puts about 200 carriers, which are all modulated with complex modulation, quadrature modulation systems, or ways that put a lot of information or a lot of bits onto a given carrier. And it produces very, very high quality, even stereo. We broadcast from Ecuador for quite a while using a 25 kilowatt PEP, what had been a sideband transmitter, but we were using it with the DRM signal. And it was heard very well in the States in stereo, and very good quality.
Now, do you hear broadcast stations in America using DRM? Or is this something that's only used by the shortwave broadcasters?
I don't think there are any AM broadcasts in the States, and there are in India. It turns out that India, getting back to the country that was so backward 50 years ago, in my opinion, in my experience, are now leading the way in going digital with their AM and shortwave broadcasting network. And so they have a lot of transmitters there now that are broadcasting digital.
Now there seems to be a trend across, at least I hear about it across Europe, where the Europeans are shutting down conventional broadcast stations and thinking that Wi-Fi, 4G, LTE, cellular backbone is the way to deliver signals to their listeners. Do you see that going on anyplace else? And what do you think about that?
Yes. Shortwave, analog shortwave is definitely, a lot of those stations are shutting down. In fact, it's gotten to the point where you can get 100 kilowatt, 250 kilowatt, 500 kilowatt shortwave transmitters free for the taking. In some parts of the world, just because there's so many stations that are cutting back. But that only works in places that really have a good, broadband infrastructure, which doesn't apply to large areas of Africa, and it doesn't apply to parts of Asia. So shortwave broadcasting, either digital or analog, are still pretty healthy in those areas of the world. But in Europe and in North and South America, that's really, they are shutting down. HCJB shut down about 5 years ago in South America. Maybe it's been longer than that now, but they discontinued most all of their shortwave broadcasting. They still have one transmitter down there that they use to talk to some of the minor language groups. But most of the big shortwave broadcasting organizations in Europe and North and South America are definitely cutting back.
For those amateurs with a technical interest who might also be very interested in shortwave radio, is there an opportunity, as these stations are shutting down, is there an opportunity to come and fill the void with programming on shortwave if somebody's so inclined?
There might be. I thought you were going to ask a slightly different question, which to me is kind of exciting. As these stations shut down, it sometimes takes them a little while to take down their antennas. And if a ham or a group of hams is on the ball, they can get permission to maybe go in and use some of those outrageously huge antennas for ham purposes. As far as making programs, yeah, there probably would still be some possibility of that, but I haven't really. See, I don't get into the programming end of things very much because I just play with the transmitters and antennas. Of course, I'm retired now, but even in the even when I was working, I didn't get involved with programming end much.
Well, wow, you've just caused the wheels of entrepreneurism to churn in the brains of people listening. Yeah.
How about buying an old BBC site somewhere in the far corners of the world and having the ultimate de-expedition that would be the easiest DX to work anywhere in the world because they have such huge antennas.
Well, certainly you could create some kind of ham radio travel agency where if you could coordinate the acquisition and use of these antennas for groups, that seems quite interesting as well. I'd never thought of that. Wow.
Well, I've done quite a bit of operating with those kind of antennas because when we were in Chile, we were refurbishing a big station down there. That was just one example, but we were refurbishing a big shortwave station in Chile 20 years ago. And it took a year to do that. And during that year, I was able to use their big shortwave curtains and log periodics to operate on the ham bands. And it was truly spectacular.
Now, I heard an interview that you did, I think, on the QSO show, which is also, I believe, Ted Randall's a shortwave broadcaster.
Right.
Where you talked about a 24-element quad antenna?
Yes.
Where was that and what was that?
That was in Quito, Ecuador, and the quad was invented, or at least heavily promoted by Clarence Moore, who was a engineer at HCJB, and he donated an antenna for us down there, which consisted of 4 booms, 2 high and 2 wide, and each boom had 6 quad elements on it. So it was a total of 24 elements. It was beaming toward Europe, and the nice thing about it was for the 20. The so-called 13-meter shortwave broadcast band, which is from 21,450 on to about 21,750. So it actually borders our 15-meter ham band. So we were able to use that from time to time for 15 meters pointed at Europe.
Now, I read somewhere that you've done a number of studies on the use of ground radials to improve vertical antenna performance. Unless you have a large open field to lay the ground radials, is a vertical antenna the right antenna for a city lot? And what would you suggest in its stead?
A vertical is has the lower you go in frequency, the more attractive a vertical becomes. That's simply because if you're talking about a DX antenna. A DX antenna, to really get down a low angle, has got to be about a half wavelength up in the air. And so on on 40 meters, that's doable. On 80 meters, it's difficult. On 160 meters, it's impossible for most mortals. So that's where, to me, the vertical antennas really come into their own, or arrays of verticals, if you can swing that. And yeah, I still, if I were putting up a vertical today for those bands, I probably still would go with the in-ground radials. There's been a lot of talk about elevated radials and so forth, but I think the in-ground radials have they work quite well and are trouble-free. So if I were a big-time DXer on either 160 or 75 meters, I would probably go with some kind of radial or system of radial. I mean, a vertical or system of verticals.
But you really need a large lot for all of those radials on the ground or in ground, right? It's
well, not huge, because let's take 75 meters. If you can put up a 60-foot mast, which could be a tower with other antennas on it, about the minimum that you would want to have would be a 16 radials, about a tenth of a wavelength each. So a tenth of a wavelength on 80 meters is 8 meters. So if that tower was at the center of your lot, you could put down 8 meters in every direction. In fact, I would just run each radial to the edge of the lot. Some would be 6 meters, some would be 8, some would be 10, or maybe 12, whatever, depending on the lot size. And that would be a decent antenna system. And probably the gain of that antenna would be within 3 dB of having a perfect radial system.
Okay, so I was operating under the wrong assumption, and that was that you had to have at least a quarter wave on each of those radials going off from the bottom of that antenna in all directions. So if you're talking a tenth of a wavelength, then that actually could make it more manageable.
Yes, absolutely. And that was the article that I originally wrote on that subject was in 1976. It was published in QST, and they have continued to reproduce the chart that I came up with in the handbook that gives the trade-off between number of radials, length of radials, and how much power you lose. And it turns out that the minimum I would recommend would be 16 radials, at least a tenth wavelength long. And in most cases, depending on many different factors like the ground conductivity and that will get you within 3 dB of a huge radial system, and that's pretty good. You could double your transmitter power unless you're already running the legal limit. You could double your transmitter power more easily than you could put down hundreds of quarter wave radials.
So to make it more personal, I'm sitting on the side of a limestone hill. My backyard goes out from the back of the house about maybe 5 meters. I've got a chain link fence on the edge, and then it's a cliff after that. Now I could run the radials from, if I put the vertical antenna out on the fence, and then I've got maybe it's all downhill from there. But I could run the radials behind the antenna. Can I run the radials down the side of the cliff? And would I still have performance in the direction of the cliff?
Yes, that's exactly what I would do. If you run all the radials, you can get a little bit of directivity, not a lot, but a little bit of directivity from a vertical by putting all the radials in one direction, and it will work better in the direction that the radials are pointing. So I would definitely, if you're able to do so, run the radials down that cliff, and that will help the signal roll out in that direction. And the fact that you have the cliff will also be helping, of course.
Right, because then the vertical antenna looks like maybe like a vertical dipole.
Yes, it makes it more like more like an elevated vertical dipole.
Okay, well that's very cool. When you were talking a little bit earlier about building balanced tuners, are these tuners actually sitting on your operating position next to the rig, or do you actually kind of put them out, near where the feed line exits the house?
They are in the shack, but typically I put them. I want them to be within arm's reach so that I can look at the SWR meter on the rig and tune for minimum. Although I have make some tuners with a built-in SWR meter, But then you still have got to be able to push the push to talk or the key or whatever. You got to be able to key the transmitter on while you're adjusting the tuner. So they're usually within an arm's reach of the rig.
And you mentioned earlier that you like to operate PSK31?
Yes.
Uh-huh. Have you tried FT8?
No, the only thing that keeps me from doing it is I haven't found a version of it yet that will run on Linux.
So I had somebody send me a question, actually yesterday, whether I thought that the digital modes perhaps were the death knell to ham radio. Well, what do you think about that statement? And would you say that the digital modes are the death knell of ham radio?
Not at all. I think that they are. I think there's something we need to be getting involved in. I'm not sure what exactly they meant by death of ham radio. I mentioned Uncle Harvey, who helped me get my first novice license. He dropped out of ham radio because he was unwilling to adopt single sideband. He was an old AM guy, and he just was unwilling to do that. And I don't hold that against him. I think it's sad. If people are so committed to CW, which is a beautiful mode, it's a lovely mode, but they're so committed to that, or they're so committed to sideband that they can't move with the times, then some will drop out. But I think it's sad when they do that. I think if you say it's the death of ham radio, it might be the death of certain types of ham radio, but not of ham radio itself.
Yeah, I think ham radio has become this enormous tent where we just have all kinds of ways to accommodate just about every interest. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah, there are so many different ways you can go. There are certain things that I admire a great deal but have never been involved in. One of them is emergency communications. One of the reasons for that is I've been all over the place. I've never been in one location until recently. By the time I was too old to be tromping around out in the field so much. But I tremendously admire people that are in emergency communications, but I've never done that. But that doesn't mean that it's not meaningful to them, and to me, one of the most valuable parts of the hobby. But yeah, there's so many different directions you can go, and I say the more the better.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Well, actually, I do like the digital modes. Now, better said, I like weak signal modes. And I, of course, am as much of a shortwave listener or a radio listener. I love the AM band. I'm as much of a radio listener as I am of an operator. And recently, a few years back, I built a receiver, digital, software-defined receiver. I built a software-defined receiver that was so sensitive and had such good software, which was all free software, by the way. I could tune on the AM band, okay, and I could tune to a certain channel. Let's say 1400 kilohertz. I could spread out the bandwidth, so I'm looking plus or minus 20 hertz from that carrier, and I could dig out of the noise floor 8 or 10 carriers from AM stations within 200-300 miles of my QTH. I don't know of any other way to detect the fact when you've got a strong local station. I could do that even with a strong local station. I could see other carriers that were 30 dB weaker than that guy, just because I use such a very narrow bandwidth and dug down into the noise. So I'm very intrigued with these very narrow bandwidth modes. And, of course, that all has to do with space communications as well, moon bounce and all of that kind of stuff. So I don't do all of those things, but I'm very intrigued with them.
Now, you mentioned that you are excited by and collect test equipment. I, too, love test equipment. What do you have on your bench that's the most interesting?
Well, I would say one of the most useful things that I have, of course, is a good oscilloscope, and at least dual trace, if not multi-trace, and so that's very, very important. I like every kind of signal generator imaginable, and I have a plethora of signal generators.
Do you have an 8640B?
What is it?
That's the HP.
Yeah, the HP. No, I don't. I have had. That's the big HP that covers what
DC to blue light.
Right. Okay. Now I tell you one. I used to work for the General Radio Company. When I was at MIT, I did some co-op for the General Radio Company, and I have all of their signal generators. I love those.
And do you still have some?
Yes, I've got them all, and I use them frequently.
Really? Okay, give me a model number so I can put it in the show notes page.
I'll have to go look.
Okay.
But yeah, they made a set of signal generators that are called unit oscillators, and I have them that go all the way from a couple of hundred kilohertz up through 2 gigahertz. All tube type stuff, of course. I've got a Tektronix signal generator that was used for calibrating oscilloscopes, and it will put out very accurately calibrated levels of RF at frequencies from 50 kilohertz up to 50 megahertz. So I like to play with that.
What's the project on your bench today?
Well, I've got an antenna tuner underway. The antenna tuner that I use with my 100-watt rig is one that's copied after the Drake antenna tuners that they used to make. It's an interesting circuit. It uses a pi network, but it's got 2 capacitors on the output side, one series and one parallel. And I built one of those for several hundred watts rating a while back, and now I'm working on a QRP version of that.
Does that have a roller inductor inside?
No, it has switched inductors. And basically, I've added the Drake only covered the five shortwave bands that we knew back in the days when Drake, was a famous company. I guess their gear is still famous, but the company's not around anymore. But I added all of the work bands and everything on the one that I built, and it's a tuner that it forces you to use a reasonable value of Q. When you design a tuner, you have to be very careful to make sure that the Q value, or when you adjust a tuner, you have to make sure that the Q value is a reasonable value. If not, if it's too high, you'll have a lot of loss. If it's too low, you won't be able to match a very big range of impedances. By the way, another thing I've enjoyed doing is writing for Wikipedia. And a lot of the technical articles in Wikipedia are pretty good, and a lot of them are in need of help. But one of the articles that I wrote quite a bit of for Wikipedia was the antenna tuners article. So anybody that wants to have a good overview of all the different kinds of antenna tuners, both for balanced line and unbalanced line, should go read the Wikipedia article.
Now, have you found articles in Wikipedia where you find that they're either poorly written or they're just misstating the technical facts? And have you been able to edit them?
Yeah, I tried to do that quite frequently. I've got one, I won't mention this one, but there's one article I've contributed to, and just recently, of course, the beauty of Wikipedia is also its great fault, and that is anybody can go in and put anything. And on one of the antenna articles there, a guy went in recently and put some stuff that's kind of nonsensical, and I'm debating whether to go and edit it out, because in checking up on the particular guy that did that, I found out he's a little bit hard to go. Let's say he's personality challenged. So I'm not sure that I want to get into a edit war with him. But yeah, there are some articles that are very, very good and very, very technically advanced. Way beyond anything that I, I'm aware of in some cases. But there are a lot of them that do need some work. So, and one of the reasons I like to write for Wikipedia is if you look at the number of people that look at those articles, like that tuner article, I think between 100 and 200 people a day look at that tuner article. And, if I write something for QST, which I'm obviously going to continue to do, maybe the month that the magazine comes out, a few thousand people probably read the article, and then after that, nobody does, or very few. But in Wikipedia, the number of people that read those things is huge, and so keeping those articles technically accurate to me is it's something I would really like to see more hams get involved that are knowledgeable in doing that.
Well, maybe that's something that the ARRL at some point will consider, and that is to put a better search engine on their huge body of written literature, so that hams can go back into it with or without a membership, perhaps. But that it actually, the indexing works really well, so you can actually find the articles you want.
That would be good. Yes.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
I guess the main, as I've been thinking a little bit about all of these people that have influenced me over the years and the friends that I've made, I guess I would say this. I think we should remember that ham radio is about people. Communications isn't any good unless there's someone to communicate with. On the bands that are not very popular, it's because there aren't enough people on the band. And so, we enjoy the equipment. Most of us hams are kind of nerdy types. We're not people, shall we say. But, we need to make an effort to remember that friendships are what will last. And I can think of people that I've known for my whole ham career, and they mean a lot more to me than any of the equipment, any of the antennas or rigs. And so I would say to a young guy, treasure the older guys. Of course, it's easy for me to say that, being one of them. But learn all you can from the older guys, but also pass along your knowledge to the younger guys. And just remember that people are what matter.
Right. Adopt an Elmer.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep.
John, it's been a lot of fun to talk to you, and it's quite eye-opening. And you're the kind of guy that isn't afraid of a challenge, and to travel around the world and share what he knows and bring back what he learned. So with that, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast, and wish you 73.
Well, thank you, and I wish you the best 73s also.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with John. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K4ERO in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. These sponsors are very important to QSO Today. Please let them know when you make a purchase of these fine radios that you heard it here on QSO Today. I want to thank all of you for your kind words, comments, and messages about episode 200. It was a lot of fun for me to change sides, and I appreciate Jim Wilson, K5ND, for guest hosting. We are all set and off for another 200. I can't wait. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. The best way to listen to QSO Today and your other favorite podcasts is to use a podcast manager app in your smartphone, tablet, or computer. These apps keep your episodes up to date. I still use Stitcher. You can also now ask your Amazon Dot by saying, "Alexa, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." It works pretty well. Next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media, who is solely responsible for its content.